All right, let's get right into it. When I say American Revolution, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably taxes or maybe that famous party in Boston Harbor. But what if the story you and I were taught missed the real point entirely? So let's tackle the biggest misconception head on. Was this entire nation-forging war really just about a few taxes? The short answer? Nope, not at all. The taxes were just a symptom. They were the tip of a much, much bigger iceberg. Fine, fine. If it wasn't the taxes, it has to be the tea, right? I mean, the Boston Tea Party is one of the most iconic events in American history. That's gotta be the reason. That's also a big no. In fact, the famous Tea Party wasn't even about the price of tea. It was about something way more fundamental. So what was it about? Well, the real fight came down to two major things: who gets to make the rules and who gets to control the money. This was a battle for political power, for deep-seated principles, and, believe it or not, for the right to smuggle. To really get this, we've got to rewind a bit. Our story doesn't start in the colonies. It actually starts with the end of a massive global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Britain won, which sounds great, but that victory came with a truly astronomical price tag. Britain was staring down the barrel of a £150 million war debt. That number is staggering. The interest payments alone ate up half of the entire government's budget. So they were desperate for cash, and they turned their gaze toward the American colonies, figuring, hey, you guys benefited from the war. You can help pay for it. Now, this is a really important point. The colonists weren't against taxes in general. For decades, they had old taxes, things like the Molasses Act, which were really about controlling trade. Plus, they were pretty easy to get around by, smuggling. But these new taxes were different. Their only purpose was to raise money for Britain. And to make sure they got every penny, Britain set up new courts for smugglers, taking away the power of local juries. That did not go over well. And that new approach kicked off this decade-long back and forth. Britain would pass an act, the colonists would get angry, and then they'd take action. And with each round, the resistance got stronger and more organized. It really blew up with the Stamp Act in 1765. This was a direct tax on pretty much all paper goods. We're talking newspapers, legal documents, you name it. Now, think about that. Who does that directly affect the most? Printers and lawyers. The people who are best at communicating and arguing. It was a huge mistake. The backlash was insane, leading to organized boycotts and the first real coordinated pushback, the Stamp Act Congress. And this gets to the heart of it. For over 100 years, the colonies had been taxing themselves through their own elected bodies. The issue wasn't the money changing hands, it was who was telling them to hand it over. They had 0 representatives in the British Parliament, so they felt it had no right to take their money. You've heard the phrase, no taxation without representation? This is where it comes from. You can actually see the resistance grow up over time. It started as just individual smugglers trying to save a buck. Then it grew into these organized colony-wide boycotts where people agreed not to buy British goods. And finally, it blossomed into a pretty sophisticated political machine with the Committees of Correspondence, which were basically a network for sharing information and building a unified American identity. Now, Britain did eventually repeal the Stamp Act, but they didn't learn their lesson about the core principle. After a few more clumsy attempts at taxes, the whole conflict finally boiled over, leading to that showdown over tea. And here is the craziest part of this whole story. The Tea Act of 1773 did not raise the tax on tea. Get this, it actually lowered the price of legal tea. The goal was to bail out the failing British East India Company by giving it a monopoly, letting it sell tea cheaper than even the smuggled stuff. So why on earth would they be so mad about cheaper tea? Because it was a trap. Tea was something everybody drank. If they agreed to pay this one little tax, even if it saved the money, they'd be admitting that Parliament had the right to tax them. It would set a precedent. It would be like opening a door that they could never close again. So they made their move. On a cold December night, colonists stormed the ships in Boston Harbor and dumped all that tea overboard. And let's be clear, this wasn't a small gesture. In today's money, they destroyed about $4 million worth of tea. This was a massive, expensive, and very loud statement. The colonists expected Britain to back down, just like they had before. But this time, they were wrong. Britain's response was furious.
They passed a set of laws so harsh, the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. They basically shut down the government in Massachusetts, forced people to let British soldiers live in their homes, and made other moves designed to punish them. But instead of crushing Massachusetts, these acts just made all the other colonies say, whoa, if they can do that to them, they can do it to us. And that was the final straw. Britain's heavy-handed response didn't end the resistance, it transformed it. The colonists stopped just protesting for their rights as British citizens and started building a new government for themselves.
Things moved really fast after that. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met for the First Continental Congress to coordinate a plan. By April of 75, the first shots of war were fired at Lexington and Concord. But the final ideological push came just a few months later. Not from a battlefield, but from a little pamphlet that absolutely electrified the colonies.
And we really can't overstate how huge that First Continental Congress was. This wasn't just a strongly worded letter committee, it was acting like a real unified government for the colonies. By organizing boycotts and encouraging people to make their own goods, it was taking economic control away from Britain. That act, right there, was arguably the real start of the revolution.
This new way of thinking was captured perfectly by a writer named Thomas Paine. In his pamphlet, Common Sense, he just laid it out there in plain English. There is something absurd, he wrote, in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. It sounds obvious to us now, but back then, that was a mind-blowing idea.
Common Sense became an instant bestseller, and its core argument was a game-changer. Paine said, forget about fighting for your rights as Englishmen. You should be fighting for your natural rights as human beings, rights that come from nature and God, not from some king or parliament across the ocean. This was the final mental leap they needed to make.
So, that brings us to the single most important thing to take away from all this. The American Revolution wasn't the war itself. The revolution was the change that happened in people's minds over 10 years. That shift from wanting fair treatment to wanting a whole new country. The war for independence was just what they had to do to make that new reality stick.
And that's the question this whole story leaves us with. When does fighting for a principle cross the line into fighting for a new nation? The American story suggests it happens when a people decide that the system they're in is fundamentally incompatible with what they believe, and they're brave enough, or maybe just desperate enough, to build a new one from scratch.